Welcome back to the cryptoworld channel, everyone. My name is Josh, and there is good news for Bitcoin here on the weekly Bitcoin chart as we're seeing this signal continue to play out. So I'll be talking about that in just a moment alongside Ethereum later in this video, which is starting to show some positive signs. So definitely make sure you stick around to the end of this video so that you don't miss out on any of this important information. First of all, starting off on the weekly Bitcoin chart, and the next weekly candle close, which is coming up in just a few hours, is actually starting to look pretty good because over the past one day, we have seen a bounce in the Bitcoin price from around that $17,000 price level, which I've been talking about for the past 3 days. And this bounce in the Bitcoin price over the past one day is obviously forming a massive wick in this weekly candle. And generally speaking, when we see a massive wick to the downside, that means there's a lot of buying demand in that region. And in fact, if you're looking at this entire weekly candle, just a massive red candle to the downside with a huge wick forming in the candle right now, this is looking very similar to the weekly candle that we saw back in the March 2020 crash. And I spoke more about that comparison between the current price action and the March 2020 price action in my last video on the channel that I posted yesterday. But what I said in yesterday's video is the fact that we're still yet to see a wick in this weekly candle. But obviously, since yesterday's video, over the past one day, we have now formed this wick, which is great to see. And not only that, but looking at the weekly Bitcoin RSI, this is still extremely oversold, but technically the RSI is not confirmed into place until we see the weekly candle close, considering the RSI by default is calculated by candle closes. So once again, we have the weekly candle close coming up in just a couple hours, where we would likely confirm the lowest RSI print on the weekly time frame for Bitcoin, which is actually a good signal for the price of Bitcoin on the bigger picture here. Of course, this is not a short-term signal, but looking at the previous times where we've seen the RSI either oversold or very close to oversold, this is usually happening around the times where we see a macro Bitcoin bottom, just a massive bottom in the Bitcoin price action. And also what we saw back in March 2020 was obviously a drop down towards that 300-week moving average, which is the blue line, and we saw something very similar this time around. Now, we did fall a little bit short of that moving average. We went down to around 17,500 instead of pretty much 17,000. But with that being said, going back to that March 2020 capitulation, after we saw that huge wick to the downside, close to the 300-week moving average, we ended up seeing the weekly candle close slightly below the 200-week moving average. But basically, the weekly candle close was much closer to the 200-week than it was to the 300-week, and right now we're seeing something similar, especially over the past 1 day worth of price action. And alongside all of that, what we are also seeing with this weekly candle close coming up in a couple hours is a massive spike in the weekly volume for Bitcoin. In fact, on the majority of the big exchanges out there, we're currently seeing the biggest spike in volume on the weekly chart since the May 2021 crash. Obviously, that was a massive capitulation. And what we saw towards the end of that May 2021 crash, which was actually quite similar to the end of the March 2020 crash, was a huge wick to the downside on the weekly chart. And once again, a massive spike in volume like March 2020 and also like the bottom of the 2018 bear markets. But in that example, we didn't have as big of a wick to the downside. Now, for those of you who have been watching my videos for at least the last 1 month or so, you might be wondering, well, what about this other spike in volume that we saw about a month ago? Because obviously we did end up seeing a massive spike in volume about a month ago when Luna collapsed and we saw a capitulation in the Bitcoin price down towards 25,000. And you could certainly make the argument that that was basically a false signal in the volume indicator, because obviously we did not bottom out at around 25,000. But once again, as I said in my videos back then, you can even go back on the channel and watch if you want. I said in almost all of my videos back then that Bitcoin still has room to the downside because back then the weekly RSI was not oversold, for example. Also, at that time, a month ago, we hadn't yet reached the 200-week moving average, where we usually reach towards the bottom of a bear market. And also, I was discussing in those videos that usually when we see a massive capitulation like this with a huge spike in volume, in the 2018 example and the 2021 example, we actually ended up forming one more lower low after we saw the capitulation with the spike in volume. So basically, because of those 3 reasons that I outlined over and over again in my videos about a month ago, we technically had more room to the downside below 25k, and obviously right now in recent weeks we have made a lot of use of that room to the downside. And so due to all of those reasons, this weekly candle is shaping up to look better than what we saw a month ago. Because not only do we have a similar candle wick to the downside like what we saw a month ago and all of these other major Bitcoin bottoms, but on top of that, the volume for this weekly candle is bigger than what we saw a month ago, which means even more Bitcoin this week in particular has changed hands. And not only that, but we've seen the Bitcoin price drop below the 200-week moving average, close to the 300-week moving average like March 2020, and we also have the weekly Bitcoin RSI in oversold territories, which we did not see a month ago. And now looking at the daily Bitcoin chart, we actually got this signal right here around a week ago approximately. This right here, by the way, is the hash ribbons indicator, and basically it's derived from the Bitcoin hash rate, and anytime we see this capitulation signal show up, that usually means we're about to see, or we are seeing, a pullback in the Bitcoin hash rate, and this usually happens because the Bitcoin price drops so low that for a period of time, the Bitcoin miners, the people mining Bitcoin, are essentially unprofitable because their electricity costs are costing more than the Bitcoin that they are producing. And so when we see this happen, when we see a pullback or a capitulation, if you want to call it that, in the hash rate or in the miners, we end up seeing some Bitcoin miners turn off their machines, which reduces hash rate. But every 2016 Bitcoin blocks mined, which is usually every 2 weeks approximately, we see what's called a Bitcoin difficulty adjustment, where Bitcoin basically reduces the difficulty if the hash rate reduces. And by difficulty, I mean the difficulty to mine Bitcoin. So it makes it easier to mine Bitcoin, which then makes it more profitable to mine Bitcoin. And then eventually the Bitcoin miners come back online. And then when we see that happen, we see the Bitcoin hash rate go up, which is basically happening the majority of the time. Almost all the time, the Bitcoin hash rate is increasing because, of course, computers are getting faster as well. And so the majority of the time, every 2016 Bitcoin blocks, the difficulty adjustment is actually making it slightly harder to mine Bitcoin as the Bitcoin hash rate is going higher and higher. And that is to stop the Bitcoin miners from mining a lot of Bitcoin blocks all at once and to keep that approximate 10-minute time interval between each Bitcoin block. And so it's not very common to see the Bitcoin miners capitulate. Of course, it does happen from time to time, but generally speaking, it's a fairly rare event that we don't see too often, where once again we see a pullback in the Bitcoin hash rates once mining profitability is low, and that's pretty much the situation right now. But when it comes to this hash ribbons indicator, before we can start flipping more bullish, we ideally need to see this blue buy signal pop up after we see a longer capitulation that normally lasts for around a few weeks on average, talking about 2 to 4 weeks or so. And once again, we have already seen this capitulation signal for roughly around 1 week. And if you want to know more about this signal and what it means for the Bitcoin price moving forward, check out this video that I posted around a week ago titled "Huge Signal Just Flashed," because in that video I talked more about what this actually means for the Bitcoin price moving forward. And now taking a look at the shorter term Bitcoin price action here on the 12-hour chart, right now we're actually seeing a new bullish divergence form here on the 12-hour chart. And if we're looking at the last time where we saw a bullish divergence here on the 12-hour Bitcoin chart, that was roughly around 1 month ago when we had that previous capitulation when Luna collapsed. And not long after we formed that 12-hour Bitcoin bullish divergence, we also saw a bullish cross in the 12-hour Bitcoin MACD, and right now we're getting close to a bullish cross in the 12-hour Bitcoin MACD, but we're not there just yet. But we do have an active bullish divergence here on the 12-hour chart. So basically, when it comes to the shorter term price action, we could be in a very similar situation at the moment to what we were in roughly around a month ago, which means in the coming days, we'll most likely see a lot of choppy sideways price action. I wouldn't really be expecting a massive move in the Bitcoin price, especially over the next couple days or so. And heading into the Ethereum part of this video, here on the 12-hour Ethereum chart, the same thing as I just said for Bitcoin can basically be repeated right here. Because obviously here in the shorter term price action for Ethereum, we're seeing a lot of similarities around this bullish divergence and this bullish cross in the 12-hour Bitcoin MACD to what we saw roughly around a month ago before we experienced a lot more choppy sideways price action. And if you're zooming out to the weekly Ethereum chart, what is great to see for this weekly candle close is obviously a massive wick to the downside, but not only that, at the time of recording this video, the price of Ethereum is trading back above the 38.2% Fibonacci level, which is coming in at just above $1,000. So once again, the next weekly candle close is in just a couple hours from the time of recording this video. And when we see the weekly candle close confirm, if we see the price of Ethereum at that time above $1,000 or ideally above 1,050, where more specifically this line is coming into play, then that would actually be very good news for Ethereum here on the weekly chart. chart, and also the weekly Ethereum RSI is currently in oversold territories. In fact, right now, it's the most oversold we have ever seen in Ethereum's entire price history. And once again, this actually gets confirmed in place at the weekly candle close in a couple hours. And now taking a look at the weekly Ethereum versus Bitcoin chart, and right now we're still experiencing a short-term bounce from this upwards trending line of support, which is coming into play at around 0.049 Bitcoin per Ethereum. But if we're looking at Ethereum's only other bear market, which was the 2018 bear market, looking at that entire bear market compared to this bear market so far, I'm sure you can see just by this chart alone why I am still leaning more bearish than bullish when it comes to the larger trend for Ethereum versus Bitcoin. Now, keep in mind, this is the larger trend I'm talking about, not these short-term movements in the Ethereum price. And also keep in mind, this is for Ethereum versus Bitcoin, not Ethereum against the US dollar, which essentially means I do continue to expect the larger trend for Ethereum to continue to underperform against Bitcoin, especially while the overall crypto market is still in this bearish phase. And even in the most bullish scenario possible for the crypto market, where let's just say if the bear market bottoms and we see a massive Bitcoin pump, even if that happens, one of the most bullish scenarios possible, we could still end up seeing Ethereum versus Bitcoin continue to pull back, because that is pretty much exactly what we saw at the end of the 2018 bear market, because this bottom right here was the end of the 2018 bear market for Bitcoin and Ethereum against the US dollar. But Ethereum versus Bitcoin continued one more major leg to the downside, because during that time period, both Bitcoin and Ethereum were actually pumping against the US dollar in early 2019. But during that time period in the crypto market, we saw Bitcoin outperform Ethereum, which is why Ethereum versus Bitcoin continued to crash. So basically, when the entire crypto market is in a bearish phase, basically when we're in a bear market, it's quite normal to see Ethereum and especially the majority of the altcoin market underperform against Bitcoin during the bear market. But then even when the bear market actually bottoms out and we start pumping back to the upside against the US dollar, we still see altcoins and even Ethereum underperform against Bitcoin initially. And then after we're bullish for some time, then the altcoins begin to gather momentum as more investors move away from Bitcoin during the later stages in the bull market and decide to look for more risky bets in smaller altcoins. So that's just my perspective on the market at the moment based on the data that we have in front of us and based on my own experience in that previous 2018 bear market, because I was in the market during that entire time period. And make sure to check out this video popping up right here on your screen if you want to know how to keep making money in crypto even if prices are going down. But anyway, that is everything that I have to say for today. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all in the next video.